There's a switch on your wall right now. Small. White, probably. You've flipped it 1,000 times without thinking, and in about 4 seconds, the room around you gets cold. Now, here's the part that should stop you. As late as 1960, only 13 out of every 100 American homes had that switch at all. Not 13% of poor households. 13% of all households, rich, poor, north, south, city, farm. The other 87% just sweated. Through childhoods, through marriages, through entire careers, through summers that, in some cities, killed people by the hundreds, and nobody called it a crisis. So how did they do it? How does a baby survive a July night in a brick apartment with no airflow and a fever on top of it? How does a factory worker put in a 10-hour shift standing over machinery that's already radiating its own heat, on top of the sun doing the same thing through a tin roof? And who, exactly, decided that fixing this wasn't urgent for 60 straight years? Here's what's coming. A rooftop turned into a bedroom. A print shop in Brooklyn where the real problem was never people. It was ink. A movie theater that figured out cold air sells more tickets than the movie does. A financing trick buried inside a mortgage form that did more to change the American map than the invention itself ever did. And a stretch of desert that had no business holding 6 million people. Until, suddenly, it did. Because this isn't really a story about machines. It's a story about who gets to be comfortable and who has to wait, sometimes for generations, for comfort to trickle down to them. The technology existed decades before it reached your grandmother's house. The only question was who it was built for first, and why everyone else was left standing in the heat a little longer. Picture a house in, say, 1935. Doesn't matter much where. New Orleans, Memphis, a mill town in the Carolinas. What matters is the ceiling. It's high, 10, sometimes 12 feet. Not for style. Heat rises, and if you give it somewhere to go that isn't directly on top of your head, you've already bought yourself a few degrees of relief before you've spent a single cent on anything mechanical. Now, look at the windows. Above the doors, inside the house, there's often a smaller window, a transom, hinged so it swings open. Its whole job is to let hot air escape upward and out, while a cross breeze moves through at body height. Nobody thought of this as clever engineering at the time. It was just how you built a house if you wanted to survive August. Go outside, and in the poorer neighborhoods of the South you'll find shotgun houses, narrow, one room wide, doors lined up front to back so a breeze could travel clean through the whole structure without hitting a hallway wall. And if you climbed up top, plenty of families had a sleeping porch, an open-air room, sometimes screened, sometimes not, where you dragged a mattress on the worst nights because the inside of the house had turned into an oven and staying there simply wasn't an option anymore. There was even a separate summer kitchen, a small detached building out back, so that the act of cooking dinner didn't turn the entire house into a furnace on top of whatever the sun was already doing. None of this defeated the heat. It just gave people a way to live alongside it, to bend the house around the problem rather than solve it. And that's really the thing to sit with here. An entire branch of American architecture, refined over generations, existed purely to help people tolerate something, not eliminate it. Every design trick in this chapter is a workaround. A high ceiling doesn't cool a room. It just gives the heat a place to hide until nightfall. And people accepted that. For a long time, surviving summer wasn't a strange phrase. It was just a fact of the calendar, like flu season or the first frost. You didn't beat the heat. You outlasted it, one sleeping porch, and one cross breeze at a time. But about 30 years before any of these families were sleeping on their rooftops, a young engineer 2 states away in Brooklyn was already building the machine that would eventually make sleeping porches obsolete. He wasn't thinking about comfort. He wasn't thinking about families at all. He was thinking about ink. In the spring of 1902, a printing company in Brooklyn called Sackett and Wilhelms had a problem that had nothing to do with the weather, at least not on the surface. They printed in color, multiple passes of ink, one color layered on top of another. And Brooklyn summers were humid enough that the paper itself kept changing shape between passes. It would swell a little, shrink a little, warp just enough that the colors no longer lined up. Ink smeared. Pages jammed the feeding mechanism. An entire print run could come out ruined, and nobody at the plant could figure out why, because nobody was thinking about humidity as the enemy. They were thinking about ink and presses and deadlines. Somebody eventually brought the problem to Buffalo Forge Company, a manufacturer that mostly built industrial fans, forges, and heating equipment, not exactly a business you'd associate with comfort. And the job landed on the desk of a 25-year-old engineer named Willis Carrier, who had graduated from Cornell just 1 year earlier. Carrier didn't approach it like someone trying to invent air conditioning because, at that point, air conditioning as an idea barely existed. He approached it like an engineer with a very specific, very unglamorous question. If the real issue is moisture in the air, what happens if I control that first? He worked out that if you pass air over coils cold enough, the moisture in that air condenses out onto the coils, the same way condensation forms on a cold glass of water on a humid day. Control the humidity, and, almost as a side effect, you control the temperature too. On July 17, 1902, Carrier finalized the drawings. The system went in that summer. It worked. The paper stopped warping. The colors lined up. Nobody in that print shop was thinking, this will change how humans live. They were thinking, the ink problem is fixed. That's the detail worth sitting with. The single most consequential invention in the history of human comfort wasn't built for comfort at all. It was built to protect a stack of paper from swelling in the Brooklyn air. Carrier filed a patent for it in 1906. Apparatus for Treating Air. A title so dry and bureaucratic you'd never guess it described the thing that would eventually reshape where 60 million Americans chose to live. For more than a decade after that, this stayed almost entirely an industrial secret. Textile mills adopted it because damp cotton thread breaks less than dry thread. Pharmaceutical plants adopted it because certain products degrade in humid air. Machines, materials, product quality. That's what air conditioning was for the first 20 years of its existence. Not one person was installing it because their family was sweating through August nights. If you'd asked Willis Carrier in 1905 whether ordinary households would someday demand this in every bedroom, he probably would have found the question strange. He built a tool for factories. He had no idea he'd built a want. It would take a very different kind of business, one that sold experiences, not printed pages, to realize that the thing keeping ink from smearing could also keep an audience in their seats a little longer, in the middle of the hottest month of the year. By the early 1920s, air conditioning had spent 2 decades doing quiet, unglamorous work inside factories nobody visited. Then, in 1922, Willis Carrier installed a system in the Rivoli Theater in New York City, and something happened that had nothing to do with humidity control for machinery. People noticed how the room felt. Movie theaters at the time were desperate for a summer strategy. Attendance always cratered in July and August. Who wants to sit packed into a dark, airless room in the middle of a heat wave? So theater owners had been experimenting with crude fixes for years. Blocks of ice stacked behind fans, blowing marginally cooler air across the crowd. It helped a little. It also melted, dripped, and needed constant replacing. Carrier's system was something else entirely. Real refrigeration, real dehumidification, on a scale big enough to cool a packed auditorium, and the effect on ticket sales was immediate and, frankly, a little absurd. People weren't just choosing which movie to see. They were choosing to go to the movies, any movie, because it might be the coolest room they'd sit in all week. Theaters started advertising this directly. 20 degrees cooler inside became as much a selling point as the film on the marquee. Some people bought a ticket, sat through a picture they had zero interest in, and left only when the theater closed, purely because home was unbearable and the theater wasn't. This is the moment air conditioning quietly switched jobs. It stopped being industrial infrastructure and became a public amenity. But notice who was offering it and why. It wasn't hospitals prioritizing it for patients. It wasn't housing authorities installing it for tenants. It was businesses that had figured out cold air was a product they could sell, wrapped inside another product. Department stores caught on next, cooling their sales floors for the same reason theaters did. Get people to linger, get people to stay, get people to buy. And here's the part that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. None of this made air conditioning more available to ordinary families. It made it available to ordinary families as customers, for a few hours, in someone else's building. You could feel refrigerated air at the Rivoli on a Tuesday afternoon, and then walk home to an apartment that hadn't cooled down since June. Comfort became something you visited, not something you owned. By the late 1920s, this logic extended even further, into commercial architecture itself. The Malem Building went up in San Antonio in 1928, built from the ground up with central air conditioning as a permanent feature, not an experiment bolted on afterward. It was marketed almost like a novelty, the first fully air-conditioned skyscraper in the country. Businesses wanted their offices in it. Tenants paid a premium to work inside it. Once again, the people who got cold air first weren't families sweating in tenement housing. They were office workers, movie patrons, department store shoppers, anyone standing inside a building whose owner had calculated that comfort was profitable. So, by the end of the 1920s, you've got a strange split developing in American life. Industrial plants have had this technology for a quarter century. Theaters and stores are actively marketing it as an experience. Skyscrapers are being built around it. And yet, in actual houses, the places where people slept, raised children, lived out their actual lives, almost none of it existed yet. The gap between "we have this" and "know it saves lives and improves comfort" and "ordinary people can have it at home" wasn't a technology gap anymore. It was a business model gap. Somebody profitable had to want it in every house before it would actually get there. That gap was about to take another 2 decades to close, and along the way, an entire national tragedy would play out in the summer heat, mostly ignored while the country waited. By the early 1930s, air conditioning had theaters, department stores, and a handful of trophy office buildings. What it didn't have was any real path into the American house. And then, for most of the 1930s and all of the first half of the 1940s, that path basically closed altogether. The Depression meant most families had no spare income for anything beyond necessities, let alone a machine that, at the time, cost more than some people's monthly wages. And once the country entered World War II, the manufacturing capacity that might have gone toward home appliances went toward tanks, aircraft, and steel for the war effort instead. Factories that could have been building room air conditioners were building something else entirely. For roughly 15 years, in other words, the technology just sat there, mature and proven, waiting for a moment when the country had both the industrial capacity and the household income to actually buy it. That moment arrived almost overnight after 1945. Soldiers came home, married, started families, and moved into a housing boom unlike anything the country had seen. Entire suburbs built from scratch in a matter of months. And for the first time, manufacturers started making individual room air conditioners, compact enough to sit in a single window, designed specifically for a home, not a factory floor or a theater lobby. But available and affordable were two very different things. A window unit in the late 1940s could cost several $100s, at a time when that was close to a month's wages for an average worker. So what you got through the late 1940s and into the 1950s wasn't a country full of cool houses. You got a scattering of them. The family down the street with the one unit propped in the living room window, treated almost like a status symbol, something neighbors would comment on the way you'd comment on a new car in the driveway. By 1955, something like 1 in 22 American homes had one of these units. Not 1 in 3, not even 1 in 10, 1 in 22. So here's the strange shape of the story so far. The technology is now 53 years old. It's proven in factories. It's been selling movie tickets for 2 decades. It's sitting for sale in hardware stores in cities across the country. And still, the overwhelming majority of American families are going to bed every summer night exactly the way their grandparents did, with a fan, an open window, and whatever breeze happens to show up. That gap between it exists and it's actually in your house is about to become impossible to ignore, because the 1960 census is about to put an exact number on just how wide it still was. In 1960, the U.S. Census Bureau asked American households a fairly simple question. Does your home have air conditioning in any form? The answer that came back was 13%. Sit with that number for a second, because it's easy to read past it. 13% means that if you walked down an ordinary residential block in Chicago, or Baltimore, or Kansas City that summer, roughly 1 house out of every 7 or 8 had some way of cooling itself. The rest didn't. Not the rest had a cheaper version. Not the rest had a smaller unit. The rest had nothing mechanical at all. A fan, if they were lucky, and an open window if they weren't. And this wasn't a rural poor problem either, the way you might assume. It cut across income levels far more than people expect. Plenty of solidly middle-class families in solidly middle-class neighborhoods still didn't have it in 1960, simply because the technology had only recently become something you could buy at a price that wasn't absurd, and the habit of expecting it in a house hadn't formed yet. Air conditioning wasn't yet something people budgeted for. It was still, for most families, a genuine luxury purchase. Something you saved up for, the way you'd save for a car, not something that came standard with the idea of a home. Now put real stakes on that number. Cities in the middle of the country, St. Louis, Chicago, Kansas City, experience the kind of summer heat that turns brick and asphalt into something close to an oven overnight, because none of it cools down fast enough before the sun comes back up. Without mechanical cooling, that heat doesn't just make people uncomfortable. It kills them. Elderly residents, infants, anyone with an underlying heart or respiratory condition, These are the people whose bodies simply can't regulate temperature well enough to survive several consecutive nights above 90 degrees with no relief. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Nobody was tracking this the way we'd track it today. There was no unified national system counting heat deaths as a distinct public health category. No headline declaring a heat emergency. No coordinated cooling center response the way cities mobilize now. Heat waves killed in the hundreds in individual American cities across these decades, and it got treated in the public consciousness, almost like bad luck, an act of God, not a policy failure. Nobody was asking, out loud, why don't more people have a way to survive this? The infrastructure to save these lives already existed. It had existed, in some form, since 1902. It just hadn't reached the people who needed it most. That's the quiet cruelty sitting underneath this whole story. This was never really a story about invention. The invention was done. This was a story about distribution, about who gets access to a life-saving technology first, and how long everyone else has to wait, while the market slowly, unevenly, gets around to them. And the thing that finally broke that logjam wasn't a better machine, a cheaper unit, or a public health campaign. It was something far more boring, buried inside a piece of paperwork nobody outside the mortgage industry had ever heard of. Here's a question worth asking. If a technology has existed for 60 years, and it clearly saves lives, and factories have been proving it works since 1902, why does it take until the 1960s and 70s for most American homes to actually get it? The honest answer isn't, the machines got that much better. Central air conditioning in 1965 wasn't a dramatically different piece of engineering than central air conditioning in 1955. What changed wasn't the machine. What changed was how you were allowed to pay for it. For most families in the 1950s, air conditioning, especially central air, built into the ductwork of a whole house, was a large upfront cash expense. You didn't finance it. You saved for it, the way you'd save for a wedding, and plenty of families simply never got there, because a refrigerator or a car or a kid's tuition always came first. Air conditioning kept losing that competition for the family budget, year after year. Then something shifted, quietly, in federal housing policy. The Federal Housing Administration, the same agency backing the mortgages that were building entire suburbs across the country, began allowing the cost of central air conditioning to be rolled directly into a home loan. Instead of paying several $100s in cash up front, a family could add that cost onto a 30-year mortgage they were already taking out to buy the house itself. Suddenly, the real cost wasn't a few $100s I don't have. It was a few extra dollars a month, folded invisibly into a payment the family was making anyway. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. No new invention. No breakthrough in refrigeration science. Just a change in how the bill got split up over time. And it was enough to blow the doors off the entire market. Census data from 1960 already shows the effect taking hold. Newer homes, the ones built after this financing shift started spreading, had noticeably higher rates of central air than homes built just a few years earlier. By 1970, roughly a third of newer homes had central air, a number that had been a rounding error a decade before. There's something almost insulting about how anticlimactic this turning point is, compared to the drama you'd expect from a story about who gets to survive summer heat. Willis Carrier solved the actual engineering problem in 1902. The thing that took another 60 years to solve wasn't cooling the air. It was arranging the money so ordinary families could afford to. And once that financial bottleneck cleared, it didn't just fill in houses that already existed. It opened up entire regions of the country that, up to that point, had never been considered realistic places for large numbers of people to live year-round. For most of American history, there were places in this country people simply didn't build large cities. Not because the land was bad, but because the climate made year-round life there miserable for the sheer volume of people modern urban life required. Phoenix, Houston, much of Florida, parts of central Texas. These were places you might pass through, farm around the edges of, or retire to for a single dry winter. Not places you raised a family and built a career, decade after decade, through July after July. Then, through the 1960s and into the 1970s, something changed that had nothing to do with jobs, nothing to do with new highways, and almost nothing to do with any deliberate regional planning. Air conditioning went from 13% of homes in 1960 to nearly 37% by 1970, and it kept climbing from there, crossing the halfway mark within another decade. And as that number climbed, an entire category of American geography quietly flipped from unlivable at scale to livable at scale. Phoenix is maybe the starkest example. Before affordable air conditioning, its summer heat made it a genuinely difficult place to sustain large-scale population growth. The kind of dry, relentless heat that made every single day in July and August something to be endured, rather than lived through normally. Once central air conditioning became standard in new construction, that ceased to be a limiting factor at all. The desert didn't get any cooler. People just stopped needing it to be. Houston tells a similar story, except with humidity instead of dry desert heat, arguably an even more miserable climate to work in without mechanical cooling, since humid heat doesn't let sweat evaporate the way dry heat does, so the body's own cooling system barely functions. Houston's rise as a major American city, home to oil companies, then NASA's Mission Control, then a sprawling, genuinely enormous metro area, tracks almost exactly alongside the spread of air conditioning into homes, offices, and eventually into the cars people commuted in. This is the part of the story people rarely connect to a mortgage form footnote from the previous chapter, but it's the same mechanism, just at a larger scale. Once air conditioning became something an ordinary family could afford as part of their regular monthly housing cost, entire metro regions that had been demographic afterthoughts for 2 centuries became some of the fastest-growing areas in the entire country. Businesses followed the population. Population followed the affordability of comfort. And comfort, in this case, followed a financing rule most people never noticed being changed. By the late 20th century, the population map of the United States looked meaningfully different than it had in 1950, and a technology invented in 1902 to keep ink from smearing on a printing press in Brooklyn was, quietly, one of the biggest reasons why. So, what do you actually do with a story like this? Because on the surface, it's a story about a machine, about coils and humidity, and a patent with a title so boring nobody would guess what it led to. But underneath that, it's really a story about something less comfortable to think about. Technology doesn't spread based on how much it's needed. It spreads based on who profits from selling it first, and how long everyone else has to wait for the profitable version to trickle down to them. Willis Carrier solved the actual problem in 1902. The engineering was done. What took another 60 years wasn't science. It was priority. Factories got it because it protected profit. Theaters got it because it sold tickets. Office towers got it because tenants would pay a premium for it. And ordinary families, the people sweating through heat waves that were quietly killing their neighbors, got it last, only after somebody figured out how to fold the cost into a mortgage payment small enough not to notice. That pattern didn't end in the 1970s. It's still exactly how new comfort technologies move through this country today, whether that's rooftop solar, home batteries, or high-speed internet. The people who can afford to be early adopters get the benefit first. Everyone else waits for the financing to catch up, or the price to drop, or a policy nobody's paying attention to quietly clear the last bottleneck. And there's a strange twist at the end of this particular story. The machine that saved so many lives from heat is now part of why summers keep getting hotter. Air conditioning runs on electricity. Most of that electricity still comes from burning something. And the hotter the world gets, the more of it we run, in a loop that Willis Carrier, standing in a Brooklyn print shop in 1902, could never have imagined he was starting. So the next time you flip that switch on the wall and feel the room go cold in 4 seconds, it's worth remembering. That convenience took 60 years, one accidental invention, one movie theater's marketing trick, and one boring line item in a mortgage form to reach you. Comfort was never the hard part. Deciding who gets it, and when, always was. Some systems get built quietly. This is how.